So, hello again. Well, you certainly have risen to the challenge I left you. There's a range of really fascinating questions here. We're not going to get to them all, apologies. But it's interesting, there are certain groups or themes that have emerged in the questions. So what we're going to try to do is answer broad themes, maybe using a particular question that somebody has given as the illustrator of that. So apologies if your question isn't answered directly. If it's really burning, we'll be around for a few minutes after the session and maybe we can have a little chat at that stage. So maybe just to get into it, might ask Beth or Nicola if you have any tips on sleeping well.
I suppose I think I'm going to take this one. I better say something. I've been sitting here quietly while Nicola's been doing all the hard work. We were saying sleep is a topic that comes up so often. I think it's an issue for people at all different aspects and different stages of their life. But certainly I think as we age, sleep can become really disrupted. And actually we need less sleep the older we get. So the kind of 8 hours can sort of transition to people to more like 6 or 7 hours of, optimal kind of sleeping conditions. We talk about the idea a lot of sleep hygiene. So a little bit like we have our own personal hygiene routines and things that keep us well and keep us healthy, we sort of need to tackle our sleep in the same way. So I'd be saying if you're noticing that maybe you're having disrupted sleep, looking at, first of all, the room, the environment in which you're sleeping. Ideally, the only thing that we want to be doing in the bedroom is sleeping. We're seeing a lot more now people maybe on laptops, phones, bringing sort of the blue lights into the bedroom. That's going to keep, the mind active and make it an awful lot more difficult to sleep. So is it a soothing, calm, dark, quiet type of environment? Looking at stimulants is always a good one. So caffeine, and actually I think tea drinkers maybe don't quite realise how much caffeine can be in tea. We kind of think coffee, we think Coke, we think those kind of things, but actually there's huge amounts of caffeine within your regular tea. So maybe looking at switching to decaf or, reducing the amount of time. So thinking maybe the last caffeinated beverage in the afternoon. So addressing that. I think as well, it ties in quite well with the downshift aspect as well that Nicola was talking about within ageing. Looking at our stress routines, how we might be managing that. Are we going to bed with a full head? Is that type of thing that might be keeping us up at night? And do we need to look a little bit more at the stress and anxiety management throughout the day? So I suppose those are some of the tips. Obviously it's individual to people. I think also maybe pain and physical conditions can also disrupt sleep, and maybe talking to your doctors and medical professionals about how best to manage that aspect as well.
Yeah, we had a few questions about the sleeping issue, and it's obviously a really important one because when the sleep isn't going well, life can become a little bit more challenging and difficult during the day. And I suppose it's a recurring theme in any talk that we have here in the hospital. It seems to be a really important question for people. There's another question popping out at me here, and I'm going to ask Beth because I'm very jealous of Beth at the moment because she just last week took possession of a little rescue dog, the cutest little dog that you could imagine. So somebody has asked about the importance of pets in ageing and well-being generally, and the importance of touch and walking and companionship and that. So any thoughts, Beth?
Yeah, well, I have lots of them, as you said. I have recently got a very, very stubborn bulldog who's refusing to walk, so he's not really helping me with the exercise aspect. But I do think pets can tick a lot of the boxes again that Nicola was talking about. So yeah, they can help us maybe with exercise. If we're struggling with motivation to get out for a walk, suddenly they give us a reason maybe to do that, even if it's the short trips around the block or into the garden. That sense of purpose. So maybe if we are somebody who spent a lot of time caring for family and they're gone and actually that caring role is really important to us, it might be another way to get that kind of same sense from having a creature that we have to feed and look after. I think companionship too. I know maybe a theme of loneliness came up in some of the questions as well. Maybe if we don't have necessarily a lot of family around, if those friendships have changed, there's a wonderful warmth and companionship that we might get from a pet or from an animal. So I think it ticks a lot of those boxes, the purpose piece, the exercise, that kind of sense of connection as well. I think it'd be a way to meet people. I've certainly noticed since I've been out walking the dog, the amount of people who've stopped me in the park or who have had conversations with neighbours that have never spoken to me before. Suddenly it's opening up a whole other vehicle for conversation too. So I think it can be, really important in a way to actually, what it's doing is getting us a lot of those things that we're talking about that help with successful ageing. So it's really tying in really well with a lot of the topics that we talked
Yeah,
about.
particularly for those living alone, who may not have family or may not have the social connections. A pet can really be very beneficial in those, as Beth mentioned.
Mm.
A theme that came in our questions as well was this idea of the blue zones, which is a really fascinating reality. And I suppose thinking that the blue zones, even as on the map that you had there, Nicola, they're in very nice parts of the world with lovely climates. And I suppose thinking of the evening that we all came out in today and thinking in the greyness of our winter and our location and, the northern part of the hemisphere. Any thoughts about just our location and the context of our society here in Ireland in relation to blue zones? Is there anything we might particularly watch out for?
Well, I did challenge you all to think flexibly. So I really think that's what we need. They can give us tips, but it's up to us to adapt to how... Sorry, is that on? No. Sorry. I did challenge you to think flexibly. So it is up to us. We can get the tips from the blue zones, but it's about adapting them to our own environment. And, thinking outside the box. How can I get, say, that moving naturally into my life? I might not have been out in the garden today, but can I have moved naturally around my house? Can I have maybe gone to a local shopping centre where I could move naturally around it, or gone to an art museum? What can I do? How can I move naturally in my life, that indoors if needs be? I suppose things like diet. I suppose food is becoming more available to us all year round, particularly with the Lidls and the Aldis. I remember as a child, strawberries were a real summer treat. Now my children have them every day of the week. So we are able to get those foods for our diet. They're a lot more accessible to us. Some of the other things around connectedness. Yes, the Sicilians or the Sardinians might have their happy hour sitting out in the sun in a lovely square, but does that mean that it's not something that we can do? I suppose so. It is about challenging yourself and going, right, well, how can I do that? How can I get an aspect of that into my life, into the environment that I live in? And we're experts at living in Ireland.
And I suppose I was struck looking at the map. Yeah, well, there were all nice areas to live in, hugely different areas as well, hugely different culturally, if you compare kind of the Japanese culture to American to Greek. So there has to be something else that's kind of drawing these together. It's not maybe enough to say that it's the particular climate or the culture. So, I think the commonalities that we looked at are really important. And how do we bring them then into our own culture and our environment? We may not have the same sunshine they have in California, but how do we work around that? How do we adapt? How do we get the same exercise or values or purpose in different types of ways? So as Nicola was saying, I think it's having to be a little bit more flexible in how we do that.
Actually, Dan Buechner, the guy who did this initial research, has set up the Blue Zones project. So he's taken the lessons that he learnt. And there's a lot of research, if you're interested in it, you can find it online, because it might just help you with that flexible thinking, where in a number of different areas around America, they've introduced blue zone environments. So taken the lessons learned, gone to an environment and adapted the environment to introduce those lessons that they learned from the blue zones. And that seems to be working really, really successfully. So adapting.
And just on that idea of adapting, a number of questions came through that were thinking about the challenges of adapting to physical difficulties and maybe periods of physical ill health, and how we can actually approach managing that from a coping perspective or from a mental health perspective.
And I suppose in psychology, we always talk about how what's going on for us in our world has a huge impact on how we think, how we feel, how we behave, and the physical sensations that we can experience. And when that cycle gets turned into a negative pattern, it has a very negative impact on us, and it can be quite difficult to break that cycle. It's very hard to change our feelings if we're feeling sad, if we're feeling upset, if we're feeling anxious. But what we can look at changing is our thoughts. And what happens is that when we have a thought, as humans, we tend to turn it into fact without really looking at it properly and asking ourselves, is this a fact or not? and that can have a huge impact on us. And often there's a lot of evidence, if we look for it, that actually shows us that that negative thought we had is not a fact. We can also change that cycle by looking at our behaviour. So when we become physically unwell, that's a time where we tend to withdraw from others, and we tend maybe not to answer the phone, to turn down invites, maybe tend to stay in bed. And while there is an element of that that's necessary for recovery, you know, when we're encouraged then to start re-engaging in our life, it's important to try and do that. And after a period of unwellness, that's often a time that we find that most difficult. And what I'd always say to people is that activation precedes motivation. That it's about activating ourselves and engaging with other people, and then motivation begins to come. I suppose there is also an important aspect that, you know, physical ill health can have a huge impact on our mental health. And in older adults, often mental health difficulties kind of can get written off as general ageing. And people can actually become quite unwell with depression and anxiety and have it, you know, down to normal aging when it's not. And actually there's a lot that can be done for people like that if they get to meet the right person at the right time and get the right treatment. So I'd always encourage you to engage with your GP if you find that, you know, after, and typically from what I've noticed with my work with older adults is that often we can get through a period of stress in our lives very, you know, we can cope quite well, we do what we need to do, but it's after the fact that then suddenly it can have an impact on us, on our mood and on our anxiety levels. And I would encourage you, if you do notice that happening, that you do engage, you know, with your GP and get the right treatment that you need. Mental health difficulties, depression is not just sadness. There's many, many other symptoms of depression. Depression has cognitive symptoms. It can lead us to think, be quite hopeless in our thinking. It can have a huge impact on our thinking style. Typically, positive people can become quite negative in their thinking. It can have a huge impact on our memory. And actually I think this might touch on one of the other questions that came up. When we become unwell, it impacts as I mentioned about the negative thoughts, we get very caught up in our own internal world. And when we're caught up in our own internal world, we're not paying attention or as much attention to our external world. When we don't pay attention to something, we don't take it in. And when we don't take it in, it's not there for us to recall when we're asked to remember it, which leads us to think, my memory is impacted. I'm losing my memory. Is this it? Is this the first signs of dementia? And actually, often it is just because we're a little bit more anxious or our mood has been impacted. So mental health difficulties can have a huge impact on our memory as well. They can also have a huge impact on our behaviour. When our mood dips or when we become quite worried and anxious, we tend to withdraw socially. When we withdraw socially, that leads us to spend more time in that internal world that isn't a pretty place. So you can see how the cycle can keep going. Anxiety and depression also have a huge impact on our energy levels. We tend to feel more tired. Our sleep can be disrupted. We can require more sleep or sometimes less sleep than normal. Our appetite can be disrupted. We may eat more, or often we completely lose our appetite. Again, these are not signs, this is not natural aging. These are mental health difficulties. And so if you're someone who's sitting there that has noticed these things happening, do talk to someone about it and get the help that you need, because they're very, very treatable.
And maybe a little illustration of some of those kind of situations that you refer to, where somebody refers to an elderly parent who has begun to talk about themselves as being a nuisance. And while there's a lot of supports and a lot of very willing supports, this kind of attitude seems to present. Any thoughts?
Again, I think it's a common one that both Beth and I have come across in working, and often it's the person who has been very independent throughout their life, has been the person that has solved, the problem solver, that's always been there for everybody else. That suddenly when they find themselves in that position of needing help and being a bit more dependent, it's very hard for them to take that. And that thought about being a nuisance often comes in, or not being able to ask for help. And I'd always flip it. I'd always ask them, well, what would you say to someone you are caring for? And if they said to you that I'm a nuisance, and often they'll be able to give really good advice of how they'd bat that down. I say, well, why can't you say that to yourself? So I'd always flip it with the person, just ask them that.
And I think it ties in really with that changing sense of identity and sense of role, and how difficult that can be. Someone who may be really struggling to adapt to not being able to do the things that they might be able to do, and that piece of perspective as well. So how we might look at that ageing process. That sounds like maybe an individual who's really struggling to adjust to that change, and may need to look at changing and adapting to what they're able to do now. So how they get that same maybe sense of value or purpose. If they were someone who was very independent or used to looking after other people, can they get that in a different way if they're maybe not as physically able to do that? So I think it's about having to kind of look at your own identity, what's important to you. That values questionnaire that we've kind of given out might be useful for that. And then how you might be able to change and adapt to improve that kind of quality of life and still get the values met that are most important to you.
A lot of questions referred to loneliness, and some suggesting maybe isn't loneliness just a natural part of ageing? And I suppose, change and adapting to the loss of loved ones can be a really critical part of growing older. Any thoughts about that process of adapting to change when a loved one is gone, and the loss of physical intimacy, the loss of emotional, social support?
I think grief obviously is a very natural process and looks different for everybody. I think it is important to acknowledge that loss, and I think Nicola mentioned as well, taking time to adapt to these changes as well. I think there's of course a natural change that's going to come with that, but I don't necessarily think, I suppose the question asked maybe whether being older, that loneliness is naturally a part of that, and I suppose I don't think that has to be the case, but it might be exactly what happens if we don't change what we're doing. So if we keep existing within the same maybe social structures that we did, and maybe friends have passed away or moved on, the family situation has changed, and we're not changing anything that we're doing, I think loneliness becomes a very natural consequence of that. Of course, as we age, as we get older, I do think the opportunities for meeting people are different. So we have to really go with that flexible thinking. So is it looking, within the community more? Is it looking at kind of joining some of the groups and clubs that Nicola was talking about? Is it, the golf club? Is it bridge? Is it through, the local church? Is it the community centres? Where could I access that kind of support? And yes, it might change, so you're not going to replace maybe the support or relationship you had with a spouse with those people, but you can still get that meaning, that sense of connection in other ways. So I do think it's about having to adapt to those changes, but also allowing time for that grieving process to take place. I don't think any of us are suggesting that you should just maybe be able to move on from that. I think that's something that comes in waves and something that people deal with, over the course of a lifetime as well.
And I think small steps are important too. So it might be looking at, okay, well, this is where I am now. This is where I'd like to get to. What are the little small steps I can take to get me there? And can I say, okay, well, today I'm going to take this little small step. And next week I'm going to take that little small step to eventually get to the point that you want to reach, whatever that is.
I often use the analogy of talking to people about the high jump. So where we set the bar for ourselves. So if maybe around social connection, I'm setting the bar up here. So maybe it's going into a busy pub where I don't know anyone. It feels so overwhelming. My natural urge is to kind of run away. I'll never get over that. I'll never meet that. So I do think, as Nicola was saying, it's about starting with something that feels manageable, that feels comfortable. So is it, I'm walking in the park with my dog and I'm going to say hello to one person today. Maybe the next time I can build up my confidence and do a little bit more. So I think it's about looking at where we set the bar. We want to set ourselves up for success socially, rather than maybe feeling so overwhelmed that the urge to withdraw comes back up again. So starting small and with those small steps.
And I'm conscious that our time is moving on, but maybe just to put out one final question. And I'll read it as it's written because I think it's crafted nicely. To retire or not to retire, That is my question.
I think that's a great question. And I think that you need to ask yourself, what is my job giving me? Is it giving me a purpose in life? And am I doing it? Am I enjoying it? What am I getting from it? And if it is, why give it up? I see my dad sitting down there in the audience. I won't tell you his age because he won't be happy with me, but let's just say the age of retirement has passed him by. And for the last number of years, he keeps telling us that next year I'm going to retire. And after hearing this, maybe for about the 10th or 12th year in a row, I finally said to him, Dad, I think your job is your hobby. And he goes, yeah, I think you're right. And I said, I don't think you'll ever retire. He goes, probably not. I said, but you enjoy it. So what's wrong with that? So I think really it is very subjective experience. Do you enjoy your work? Is it giving? Is it your raison d'etre? Is it getting out of the house? Is it sparking joy in your life? And if it is, why give it up? If you can keep doing it, why give it up?
And I suppose to go with the opposite slant of that, both of my parents retired at 55 and have been living really full lives but doing other things. So they took that idea that Nicola kind of said around the time to do other stuff that maybe they hadn't in busy lives. So they have been travelling the world, they have joined choirs, they're doing a lot of volunteering, other little projects. So, I mean, it's very hard to get a hold of them. They're busier than when they were ever working, but they really took a lot of time to plan that. They had both worked full-time for a very long and knew there would be this gap there. So they really sat down, and I do think if someone is, considering retirement, thinking about that, we might get caught up in the excitement of what that looks like. And I think we see it a lot in our work, that maybe then a few months down the line, people kind of say, oh, it's not what I thought. Or that maybe they're finding they have an awful lot of time on their hands, or their jobs were actually where they got all their socialising done or gave them all their sense of purpose. So I do think it's something to consider and look at, okay, well, what would I want to do? Looking at the opportunity within it. And I think that kind of template that we gave in the handout is a useful way to look at that. And I think it tied in with maybe one of the other questions, can I be content doing nothing, was one that came up. And another one, can I do too much? So I'd be encouraging you to kind of look at how you're spending your time. Is it really heavily focused on only work, and there's lots of other aspects and areas that aren't getting the attention and you'd like to change them and spread it out? Do I have time for that relaxation? I think it's all about that balance. So it's a big decision. I think everybody is different within that. If your work is giving you that sense of purpose and enjoyment and social connection, why give that up? But also, if you feel you could get it somewhere else, it is something to consider and to plan ahead with.
And it might be about that balance, it might be about maybe going to part-time working or, fitting in work around those other things in your life if you have a job that you can do that with. So again, balance I think is really, really important.
Well, listening to the energy from both Nicola and Beth, I'm sure you'll agree that it sounds like it's a long time to leave any notion of retiring from their work. They're so passionate about it. And believe me, that translates into every day of what they do here in the hospital. So I want to thank you both for the effort that goes into preparing for tonight and for the energy it takes to come and to deliver such interesting material with such energy. Thanks to both of you.